Hello and welcome to another episode of the Beyond Room 313 Symposium. And I'm here. My name is Jason Roba, and I'm with Timothy Wild and Thomas Sheridan with a very special guest today. Today we have on Dr. Robert Deans, also known as Dr. Crow. I'm going to have Timothy go ahead and introduce Doc.
Hey, my friend. I'm so excited to have you here. I know you and I have known each other for 3 or 4 years by now. It's been a minute. I've seen your work. I'm just fascinated. I would say, well, you're definitely the first. Would you call yourself a Southern conjure man, a root worker? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say that. I would say that I have my roots in Southern conjure, for sure.
Wonderful. Yeah. The American folk magic here is it's such a beautiful tradition. I'm really looking forward to asking you more questions about that and how you work. So can you give us a little bit of your background, where you're from and your family history and how you became to be a root worker?
Well, originally, I'm from South Carolina, Kershaw County, as a matter of fact. And in South Carolina, they have when you're talking about hoodoo and conjure and that side of things, you have different flavors depending on where you're at. Like, for example, New Orleans has its own flavor, its own vibe, its own spiritual culture, its own historic culture. In South Carolina, which, is influenced by both the Spanish, the French, Haitian, you can go on and on with it. In South Carolina, you have both native and the Gullah Geechee culture that influenced the spirituality in South Carolina to a large degree, in the Mississippi Valley in general. And you have some Appalachian conjure and things that mix in there. It's a melting pot of beliefs to some extent. What's funny is that in my own family, these things weren't really spoken of. It's not like we all sat around and Mom taught us hoodoo. You know what I mean? Or Mom taught us, how to read tarot or bones, or, it was something that the elders in the family did. And it wasn't until actually I had become a grown man and had already started studying other magical and occult sciences that I realized, you know what? Maybe those things that my grandmother was doing in the back room was a little more than the Baptist practices that were discussed. And that's what it was. It was actually a coming, going full circle with it, because, we watched it growing up. My grandmother was a root worker, who I call my mawmaw. But it was never talked about. It was never discussed. So growing up, we saw things. We had the certain traditions, like, what's an example? After you visit a graveyard, you take a different route home, than you took to get there. You throw salt over your shoulder, after you speak of the dead.
Superstition.
Things like that. But as a child, you didn't connect those things to anything more than
culture.
Yeah. So after my grandmother passed away, and in my family, we were never strictly religious. We were very spiritual. I have members of my family that are more heathen, I guess would be the popular modern term for it. I have Santerias, and we breed a lot in my family, so we've
Big
expanded.
Spectrum.
Yeah. But we were free to explore these things. My parents and they didn't restrict us. It wasn't, you have to be Baptist, you have to be Protestant, you have to go to church on Sunday, there was none of that. We were free to explore. So after my grandmother passed away and I started looking into Goetia and Aleister Crowley and Wicca and these other traditions, I started reading and I started seeing similarities in what I was reading about and how certain rituals and things were done and what I had watched my grandmother do in her own home, and made those connections and kind of came full circle with it and came back to the southeastern conjure and hoodoo side of it. So,
yeah, that's very. Sorry, I was going to say it's very interesting about superstitions, because you'll find that in cultures that are very superstitious, they're also very magical. The two things definitely go hand in hand. It's almost like a magical cultural thing sets in. You see that in places like in the south of Italy, Sicily in particular, where superstition is just through the roof, but so is also magic and folklore and stuff like that. So there definitely is. I'm glad you said that, because wherever there's a high level of superstition, and that's one of those reasons why people mock superstitions, is because usually people in societies that have those rituals, like you said, throw the salt over, that kind of thing, that's because they're aware of other forces outside what the church can offer. And that's the reason why they mock superstition, not because it's stupid, because it actually is, it's hocus pocus. It frightens the organized religions, because they don't want the people knowing there's a power beyond what the priest and the minister can deliver.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's that uncertainty.
Yeah. Sorry, Jason.
Yeah.
All good. Doc, you mentioned the Goetia, and I wanted to go kind of straight in and ask, within your practice, within the practices that you do you have a book of entities in a similar way that, the Goetia has a series of Solomonic entities? Are there a group of entities that are worked with in the south of the southeast of the United States?
Well, to a certain extent, yes. But I mean, a lot of these back with in the folk tradition and all of that. I mean, you have, for example, High John the Conqueror. Okay, now you see that name thrown around a lot in a lot of the magic shops and a lot of that. We know it's a root, comes from the Morning Glory family. But there is folklore behind that, and depending on who you talk to, High John the Conqueror was a real person who was an African prince that came to this country through the diaspora, through the transatlantic slave trade, who was according to legend, an African prince, and was unstoppable. That was one of his things, that he overcame a great many obstacles, including slavery and all of that to, and again, the different myths vary from region to region. But if you want a good example, you look at in the United States, we have the Tales of Briar Rabbit, right? Well, Briar Rabbit is actually the stories of Briar Rabbit are actually based off the old folk tales of High John the Conqueror, with Briar Rabbit being High John, and how he would use his wits and cunning and will to overcome the various troubles that he found himself in. You have what we would like to call folk saints. So you have, High John the Conqueror. You have from different, like for example, Saint Cyprian has become a big one. Santa Myrta, of course, is another example. But as far as like a book, I mean, I have my own personal spirits and entities that I work with, both inside and outside what would be considered traditional Southern conjure. But you do have a lot of that, but they do change from region to region. For example, the folk saints that you may find in the Gullah Geechee, South Carolina area are going to differ than what you would find in the New Orleans, Louisiana area, which are going to differ than what you would find in Eastern Tennessee. They may be very similar. Their names may change, maybe subtle differences in the actual legends and folklore surrounding them, but they are there, and they definitely do. They do exist within the traditions themselves.
I like that a lot. It sounds real similar to the way that the spirits in the Goetia were mythologized, because they're all kings and princes and dukes.
Very much so.
And, right. And they are remnants of someone who probably once lived as a very adept magician at one point, and they've been mythologized, and people are still using those entities, not just in the Western Hermetic tradition, but there are, plenty of chaos magicians that tap into those same currents too. And it sounds like something similar with the Southern entities too, that they might not all have the same name, but it might be a similar power force, an egregore that's being tapped into the same way that people do with the Solomonic entities. But that's pretty cool. I like that.
And a similar root. I mean, when you look at cultures and religions and spiritual practices in general, you do see the archetypes. You got the tricksters, you got the magicians, you got the fertility and the mother, entities. You got the father, the sky fathers. You have the underworld entities, and they tend, and I'm probably going to get blasted apart for it, but you have similar threads throughout cultures and traditions. Yeah. And these all lead back, and it's my own personal belief. Of course, there's no archaeological evidence that clearly states it, but it is my personal belief that they all lead back to joint roots, that at some point in human history, when we were still gathered in caves and looking up at the sky and wondering what the lights were, and, running from tigers and all of that we had these similar beliefs, these similar connections that connect us all. And we've carried that down through our migrations across the earth and through the generations. These are memories. And when people talk about the ancestors, the Tuthududanan and many other cultures, these are the memories we're tapping into. These are the ancestral memories that link us all.
Yeah, totally agree with that one. I mean, the evidence for that is overwhelming, and it only gets more evidential the more you look into it. A few years ago, there was a study by the University of Lisbon and the University of Durham in England, and they were looking back to see how old folk tales were, and they discovered that they were spectacularly ancient, and there were certain kinds of, like you said, archetypes in those tales, like the concept of a smith god or a smith entity who makes a mistake while forging metal. That goes right back to probably the Bronze Age and beyond. So, like you said, as they what's the word? Best word? Distillate through different cultures, through immigration and migration. It's the same gods, but they just pick up regional flavors. Like you're very unlikely to have a sun god in northern climates, and you wouldn't have a snow or an ice giant in southern climates. But if you look at them, there's a comparable archetype that's identical with the same attributes of the initial kind of like proto-god or proto-entity. Doctor, could you just explain to me, I'm from Ireland, I've only ever heard of John the Conqueror, High John the Conqueror. Could you explain for people like myself who are not familiar with American folklore, a little bit more about that entity, person, persona, folklore?
Well, High John the Conqueror, like I said, was originally, and grant you, I'm not an expert in all the different variations of the tale, but we grew up, High John the Conqueror was a folk hero. He was someone that through his own wits and guile, because you have to remember in the American South, especially when you're talking about the African American diaspora, hoodoo and Southern conjure developed as a way to, one, preserve the culture and spiritual traditions of the Africans who came to the United States under the transatlantic slave trade. And of course, it synchronized and merged with with Christianity in all its forms and in different places. Again, you can look at Louisiana, you can look at Protestant versus Catholic. It's there. But High John the Conqueror himself was a folk hero that was able to overcome the adversity, obstacles, and horrors, really, of what was found in the New World and prosper of it. That's why it's called High John the Conqueror, because he conquers the obstacles and things before him. Now, one of the big things about High John is that he did eventually die in the United States. Depending on the actual legend or myth, it is said that his spirit went back, or he either died in the United States and he put his spirit into the High John the Conqueror root, which is where most people know the name from. And that's why that root has such power, is that High John, John the Conqueror, left that behind so that others could use his strength in their own work and to overcome their own obstacles. And it's almost kind of like King Arthur in a way, is that there are some aspects of the legend that say that, in times of need and in times of trouble, High John will one day come back, like Arthur will come back from Avalon and help his people to overcome the adversities and stuff that they find themselves in the future. But he is very much a folk hero and a folk saint. And it's been translated over and over again throughout various media, like example, Briar Rabbit, the Tales of Briar Rabbit, is probably the most widely known, other than the root itself, as far as the written aspect of High John's legend. Because for the most part, it was an oral tradition. And unfortunately, that is the oral transference of traditions is something that has slowly been on the wane over the past decades, so
sadly.
I've got a question, Doc. I know I've seen you describe yourself as a two-headed worker before. Mm-hmm. And I think I can kind of put that together, but I'm really interested to hear it directly from you as to what that means and how that works, if that's something you're comfortable talking about.
Okay. Well, again, when we're talking about titles, depending on what region, they mean different things. But when I say it, for example, I tend to say that I'm a two-handed doctor and a two-headed doctor. And what that essentially means is that I am a worker that works both with the left hand and the right hand, or I heal and I harm in equal measure, or that my practice is balanced, right? Got it. Two-headed, depending on where you're at, what I mean by it is that I don't just work through my own will, my own spirit, but I also work through other spirits. In other words, and you'll see this come up in a lot of traditions too, where you have a spirit that has your head, or that crowns you, or that you have a spiritual court that you work through. And that's essentially what that means. And it also means, some people use it as a term for mediumship, that, for example, if you read, for example, a form of divination like tarot or cartomancy, or use a pendulum, but you also work through spirits or mediumship, spirits communicating with you, that is also seen sometimes as being two-headed. Got it.
So would you say, I know in some traditions like the Loa and Voodoo and all that stuff, those are considered closed traditions. But Southern conjure and hoodoo is not. Is that correct?
Well, here's the thing. When it comes to Voodoo and voodoo, it is a closed tradition in the same aspect that Catholicism is a closed tradition. Okay. You can be a layman and go to a Catholic church and pray and donate to that church and recognize the saints and the Catholic Church as your divine authority and what you believe in. That's different than becoming a priest, right? Or joining the clergy. And I think that in a large way, for example, Voodoo is not closed. It's not closed in the fact that if you're not a member, you can't respect the Loa, or you can't, you can be a layman. There are millions of people that practice voodooism who are not Hugans or Mambos initiated, right? That's where people get it confused. Is you can recognize the Loa, but
as far as working with them, it's different.
Well, yeah, as far as working with, well, and it also depends because they do have, that's a whole nother topic as far as traditions and the organized religions versus witchcraft, because there is a difference. There is a difference between, for example, a Hugon, which is a priest, and a Boker. Okay. Sometimes a Boker can be a priest. Sometimes a priest can be a Boker, but they mean two different things. A Hugon is an initiated priest. A Boker is a sorcerer, is a witch.
Magician.
Okay. So when it comes to, I'm not comfortable saying that Voodoo is a closed practice. It's an organized religion that you can, just like with Catholicism, Baptism, Methodist, Protestant, you can, go to church and have that as your spiritual base and not be a part of the clergy. And a lot of the confusion comes is that some people think that you have to be initiated if you want to observe and respect and give honor to the Loa or the ancestors in that tradition. And that's not the case. To perform certain rituals, to perform certain rites, you should be. Like, for example, I consider myself a voodooist, but I don't initiate anybody. I don't teach voodoo. I don't teach voodoo because I'm not clergy. I have no more right to do that than I would to teach Catholicism. So that's kind of the difference. Now, as far as hoodoo goes, hoodoo and Southern conjure, most folk traditions, they're closed into the individual. They were normally oral traditions that were passed down from family to family, and they are closed in the idea that if you want to learn hoodoo or Southern conjure from me, I have the right to say no, yay or nay. Okay, that's as open as closed as it is. But there is no divine or overarching authority that says that you cannot learn hoodoo or Southern conjure.
So, like for instance, with our audience, since most of the people who watch our show are European and are not Christian, not Catholic, it's a primarily pagan group of people who are, a bunch of magicians and occultists. So it's like for our understanding of things, it's a lot closer probably to when you're talking about like in the 19th century, you had the Hermetic Order, the Golden Dawn, where there's the outer order and then the inner order, where you had a group of people who were initiated, and then there were a group of adepts. And it's not like you were saying, it's not, it's inclusive in the way that, you as you could deny or accept someone into the inner order. Which is, just a little different, like you're talking about with Catholicism and everything. I didn't grow up with Christianity in any way at all, so I look at things in an incredibly different perspective than most folks do. But it sounds kind of closer to like an initiatory order than it does like a religious order. Is that safe to say?
In some respects, yeah, okay. Absolutely. I mean, you can look at it in Freemasonry too. You have the certain circles, certain rings, certain orders. You have outer, your degrees, if you will, and the closer you get in degrees, the more you're initiated into the organization of it. It's like with, again, with Catholicism, you have your sacraments, and you take those and you go through that process, and you go from being in the congregation to being more invested into the church. And then if you want to, you can take the step further and actually join the clerical or clergy of it and join the church. And Protestant churches, you had, you could walk into any church. You yourself right now could walk on any given Sunday into a Protestant church and sit down and listen to the preacher preach. Okay. You could donate if you wanted to donate, but there is a process to where you get baptized and you become a member of the congregation. And that would be like the adept phase. Okay. You've joined the organization. Now from there, you can work up and dedicate your time to the church and to the organization or the community. And if you wanted to, you could become a member of the clergy. You become a preacher or minister yourself. It's the same way in Voodoo and Voodoo is an organized religion. It's a religion. It's not, and it's my personal philosophy that every religion, regardless of what you're talking about, has magic in it, has power in it. Okay. The only difference is whether it's organized or not, whether it's, confined itself to a certain doctrine or dogma. And then you have the outliers, which are the witches, the ones that practice outside of that ignore the taboos, or maybe get a little too close to the taboos, and maybe don't listen to the what the priest has to say and all of that. But yeah, it is very much, the Golden Dawn's a good example. Same thing. You have the degrees of how far you're investing yourself and dedicating yourself to the organization. The actual spiritual side of it, if you ask a Catholic priest, the Catholic priest is going to tell you the only way to know God is through Jesus Christ and the Holy Trinity. You ask a conjure man, you can know God sitting at your kitchen table.
Right. Yeah. And we've talked about this a lot before too. I think once you start once you start getting into those, the inner circles and the higher degrees, I'm assuming it is probably the same with your practice, is it depends a lot upon the individual, what skills and abilities they might have naturally versus, the ones that they can just cultivate through practice and repetition and things like that, or maybe having a good mentor. Is mentorship or like apprentice type? Maybe that's not the right word. You know what I'm trying to say though? Is that a thing that's like really common within conjure work?
Yes and no. And I say it's actually more common now in the modern age of things than it used to be, because in the past, like, you learned hoodoo or conjure or Appalachian witchcraft from your auntie or from your grandmother. That's who you learned it from.
Right. So each family kind of had their own little style, their own unique. Got it.
These days, because of the internet and the modern culture, as far as how information works and the interest in it, because 15 years ago, you couldn't walk into a Barnes and Noble and see anything to do with hoodoo or conjure or anything like that.
Now it's there.
Yeah. You saw, different traditions. It was, you saw books on crystals and things like that, but it really wasn't represented. One of the reasons why is because it's very much an oral tradition. It's only within the modern, within our lifetime, really, that it's become
into print,
using mainstream, but in the face to where you can go and you can read about it, you can learn about it, you can, there are various sources on it. So now the modern idea of apprenticeships and initiation and things of that nature are more prevalent than they used to be. Because it used to be, if your grandmother didn't practice, you didn't practice. Or if you didn't know an auntie or a second cousin or whoever it was that practiced, it wasn't a thing.
You just didn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would assume there's kind of like a double-edged sword to that, back then when things were more, quote unquote closed, like you're saying, if your grandma didn't or your auntie didn't practice, you didn't. Now it's just out there and anybody can go and find anything. I imagine that there's some of it that's maybe been lost because anybody can say anything they want to say online. Anybody can write anything they want to put into a book, right? So it's like, how would you recommend someone who might be new to all this or wants to get into it? How would they navigate that? And obviously with your intuition and, you need to have discernment and things like that. But just everything being out there, there's probably a lot of bullshit.
Well, when it comes to, there is. Well, first off, don't pay attention to anything Hollywood makes.
Right.
None of the movies, none of it. It's entertainment. Beyond that, it's unless you have like a physical teacher, someone that's willing, because I kind of view it the same way that you would, in the old days with martial arts, right? You had different martial arts schools. You had different regional, kung fus. That's kind of how it is in the spiritual community. What they practice in Appalachia is similar, but different than what they practice in the Southeast, which is different than what they practice, in Amish country, which is different than what they practice out in the Southwest. similar threads, but different schools, right? So when you find a mentor, like for example, if you were to come to me and want to learn hoodoo, you would be learning Crow's conjure or Dr. Crow's, school of conjure. I may do shit differently than a practitioner who hails from Louisiana or who hails from, Texas or New Mexico or Tennessee. So people use hoodoo as a very blanket term, but you're talking about hundreds of regional and family traditions that are being wrapped up into one thing. It's kind of like when you talk about in Europe, when you talk about the fae folk and the good folk, means one thing in Ireland, it's different in England or Britain.
That's very
again in Germany.
Yep. I mean,
similar,
similar. The archetypes are similar, but in England, the fae, as they know them, the fairy folk, are generally considered benevolent and helpful. Where in Ireland, they're terrified of them, the she. It's the most remarkable difference between the two cultures, and there's only a small sea separates them. And I mean, it's I love what you were saying about it's your own Doktor version of the thing. It's just like I always talk about. I've had arguments with people over the years saying, well, it gets constantly diluted, and I says, no, think of a family recipe book where recipes are handed down in a family. It's still food, it's still nourishment, it's just prepared differently. And it's the same thing with these, and this belief of this thing that you must have a central school of magic. That's very dangerous. That was in the past when you had Puritans and Inquisitions. That was a very dangerous road to go down. This is one of the great tragedies of why we've lost the spoken tradition, because someone would come into town and says, "Oh, I would like to learn about your folk cures," and they would say, "Don't tell him anything, because that could be used as prosecution later on against you in a court." If the Puritans came to town or somebody like that, the Inquisition. So that was one of the great tragedies of this. And I think when someone like yourself and people like us start to reassemblage these things into a kind of a personalized form, all we're doing is picking up the ancestors' echoes and just and keeping them alive. I find that I've always been very suspicious of schools of magic and stuff like that. And not suspicious, I don't know the word, but wary, I don't know. It's like, for instance, the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn was predominantly wealthy people, English speakers, who lived in cities. And the reason why they had that school of magic is because, well, where was all the folk magic? It was in the countryside. They were disconnected from it. So in a way, their work could be seen as their own book of magical recipes and stuff like that. But I think when it gets very formulated, it's like music, right? It's almost like when it gets really formulated and really adheres to rules, the charisma is gone. Magic's exactly the same thing. The element of the individual has to be spun into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree fully.
Doc, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you, we went down this thread a little bit earlier, but I wanted to ask you about the region and the idea of previous civilizations before this one. And when I was stationed down there in Columbia, South Carolina at Fort Jackson, I felt a strong connection to an ancient civilization that once existed all the way down to probably about the Gulf Coast. And the best way I could describe it was Atlantean. Is the way I would describe it. And wondering if any of your magic, do you think has roots in a previous civilization of folks that lived hundreds of thousands of years ago, and those traditions have been carried on, like you said, people down in caves, maybe after that civilization collapsed, if that magic is left over from what we might call an Atlantean civilization, or at least a previous high civilization?
I would actually say that, I believe that everything that we have as far as spirituality, folklore, and our joined history is descended from a previous civilization. And I say that whether you want to call it Atlantis or you want to call it, whatever name you want to give to it. That's what Plato, that's what he.
No, we're unashamed Atlanteans here, so you're in good company. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's I believe that I mean, when you look at it and you look at the pyramids and you look at even our modern structures and you look at, you know, how quickly, like if you hit the earth with a meteor or a massive flood, or which there's proof of, you know, the Younger Dryas, all of that good stuff, you know, or a super volcano goes off.
Or some disease that causes sterilization. It does happen, you know?
Yeah. So you're only talking a couple hundred years before everything we have is underground, before the earth has reclaimed it, before it's buried beneath the sands. And how much of that 2,000 years from now are people going to be able to dig up and discover? You know,
Walmart
we have no idea how many civilizations and how long man has really been on the earth. We just know what we've been able to dig up, you know? So yeah, I absolutely believe that a lot of what we have today, even as not even just spirituality, but I mean, science, knowledge, came from and descended to us in one form or another from previous generations. I mean, when you study the ancestors and when you're involved with the ancestors in a spiritual tradition, whether it be Voodoo or Hoodoo or even Celtic and Druidic magic, you know, that knowledge that they're passing on came from somewhere. You know, they have insights from times that we have no knowledge of. That's where that comes from. So in my estimation and the way I see things, it has to be. We may not have discovered it. We may not be able to definitively prove it, to put it in the textbooks, but I absolutely believe that, you know.
The evidence is there. The evidence is there. Yeah. Even outside like these kind of like hunches or these esoteric things, there's so much archaeological evidence that it's nonsense that they say it all started in the Neolithic 5,000 years ago. Yeah. There's these, I mean, I was just looking at recently, studying them, but these spears that they found all over Scotland are like about this size. They don't know what they do, but they have these highly engineered carvings on them that could not have been done any other way other than a machine. And it's like, and they were found they were found inside stone circles. So, you know, the evidence is overwhelming. Actually, I'm at the point where I'm like, how can you not say it didn't happen?
Well, I mean, and then you look at, I mean, yeah, exactly. And you look at the Indian mounds in South Carolina, you know, what we call Native American mounds, you know, and experts still can't agree over what they actually are. You know, yeah. People have been buried there, but there's also evidence that they were used for other things as well. Yep. They don't know. I mean, it's the same way with the stone circles and Stonehenge, and we know they're there. We know they were used. We know entire communities were built around them, and they were the focus of these cultures. We still don't know exactly how they were built, exactly when they were built, or exactly why they were built.
Yeah. But I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to ask you a question, and if it's outside your kind of interest, that's okay. Don't worry about answering it. In recent times, you've had the discovery of megalithic structures in the northeast of the US, Maine, New Hampshire, New York, and they seem to be steadily progressing south. They're in New Jersey now and this kind of thing, Delaware. Are you aware of any of these kind of megalithic, smoking guns down where you live in the Carolinas?
Not that I know of. Yeah. Outside of the mounds, I mean, there are what I would call cairns, okay, where they've had basically rock piles, you know, that have, you know, very simple mound-like rock piles, very similar to some of the cairns that you would find in Britain and in certain places in Scandinavia that were used in burial rites or in religious centers. A lot of them, sadly, have gone, just like with the Native American mounds. People didn't know what they were. They just thought they were hills, and they built over them and they knocked them down. And it's only, it's only very recently that they've started to look at them as something other than natural formations or you know, clutter built up from, you know, floodwaters.
And that's why they're finding them in forests, because it wasn't agricultural land.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the farmers didn't know, like you said, they weren't malicious, they just didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah. They, it was just a hill, and they needed a flat field, and they did what they had to do. Did
you ever go and take a look at Peachtree Rock before it fell over?
I did not.
That's one that felt incredibly ancient to me, and just some of the other stone structures, stones around it looked like they could have been stone structures at one point, and then it fell over while I was there. I want to say in 2014, finally toppled over.
That's weird, because when I was in that forest in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, there was a famous rock there as well that had a human face on it. It fell over like the week before I was going to see it. That's weird.
Yeah. It's actually, you talk about Fort Jackson. Fort Jackson, actually, there are large, because, there's large swaths of the fort that's nothing but woods. They use them as artillery and training grounds. That there are several mounds that were there that they, rolled over to make barracks back in the 50s. And you hear my grandfather was actually a drill sergeant on Fort Jackson back in the day. And he used to say, like, the place is haunted. Like there's spirits and things everywhere.
Oh yeah.
On Fort,
Yep.
So, and when you look at South Carolina, a lot of the Eastern Seaboard in and of itself, especially in the Southeast, like South Carolina, half the state of what we know as the state used to be underwater.
Yeah.
Like, so the coastline runs right where Columbia and all that is. So, that's one of the reasons why that area is such a hotbed for burial mounds, for standing stones, because the ancient peoples lived off the ocean. And that's where they built their communities. That's where they raised their religious sites. That's where they were gathered. So there's a lot out there. And I mean, we're just now tapping the surface. I mean, they just discovered not just discovered, it's been a couple of years, a new temple out in, Iran or Iraq that predates any other temple they found before.
Yeah.
And almost resets the geological record of when civilization was started in the Fertile Crescent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always just got such a strong impression there in South Carolina. I got drawn down to, there's those barrier islands that go all around the Gulf Coast. And the closest one that I felt drawn to from a dream was down there in Clearwater, Florida. So my wife at the time and I took a road trip down there one weekend to go scope that out. And man, that was probably one of the most transformative, if not the most transformative experience of my life, was just going and absorbing what used to be there. And again, people will say that's all bullshit and everything, but to me, it's like, no, there was absolutely some previous high civilization that created those. I don't know if it was the last iteration of civilization, or like you said, the water rose up and it exposed something that was here eons ago. But that group of barrier islands goes up there through South Carolina, Hilton Head, Parris Island, that whole area up into North Carolina, and it ends up there on the top of the West Coast, the top of the East Coast. Mm-hmm. But those islands, if you look, I love just sitting around and looking at Google Earth and finding those lines. And those, in my opinion, are absolutely man-made from some people a very, very, very long time ago. Incredibly long time.
Absolutely. I mean, even in the Gullah Geechee in the lowlands of South Carolina, you're talking St. Hel Island, that area where arguably, other than the Mississippi Delta and New Orleans, arguably one of the places where Southern conjure and hoodoo was born. You even get within the Gullah Geechee culture, even though they came from Africa, they recognize that there's a power in the land that they recognize from being similar to what they had in Africa, that there were spirits here, that there was a strong, I guess what we would call, in the European traditions, the old gods, that there were things that were older than the mountains, that were older than, the Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest mountains on earth. And you talk to them folks, and there are things still there that doesn't get talked about in church, but that is absolutely believed and absolutely still relevant.
I'm delighted you brought that up. By the way, the Appalachian mountain range really starts in Norway, runs down to Scotland and Ireland, and then across. It's the same mountain range. It just goes under the Atlantic now. But I had a friend who grew up in Kentucky, in the Appalachians, and he, like yourself, very interested in magic and this kind of thing, and folklore, which is what I absolutely love. And he came from an Ulster Scots, that's what they call it, tradition, which is a nice way of saying Irish Protestants, but that's really what they are. And he was, the whole magic thing was huge among those people there. But he told me about this thing that I'd never heard of out in many other places, of people who were shapeshifters, in that they could shapeshift into animals, and they could use this ability to shapeshift into, say, a fox or anything in order to gain access to someone's property, or into a bird to fly into some place like that. Is that tradition it exists down around you are?
Yes. It actually has, to give a broader idea. I mean, from Asian cultures like Japan, where you have the kami and a lot of those. I mean, shapeshifters exist in every culture.
Yeah.
And down south, you do have that, and depending on for example, you have the skinwalkers of the Navajo and certain Native American tribes. They have different names for them, but it amounts to the same thing. People, normally shamans, normally powerful, whether good or, whether viewed as being good or bad, who have the power to take on the forms of animals, and from foxes, coyotes, wolves, obviously in European tradition, the werewolf from Germanic culture is very and very prevalent. But yeah, it definitely does exist. It is a thing. As a matter of fact, I have some friends who believe that a lot of the cryptids and stuff that, people believe in the United States, as far as the dog man, the gator man, in South Carolina, we have the lizard man. People believe that these creatures are not necessarily a separate species unto themselves, but may actually be the remnants of these shape changers, these skinwalkers, these people who can take on the forms, whether it be a fully turning into a fox or a hybrid or something of that nature. It is definitely a belief.
So I have a question. And like Thomas said before, if it's not something you want to answer, that's totally fine. But I'm curious, within your work that you've done within Conjure and working with spirits and entities, is there a story that sticks out to you that you would be comfortable sharing of an encounter that you've had, or a working that you've done, or something along those lines of like a success that you've had, or just an encounter at all? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
What do you mean by encounter? Because that could cover a great deal.
Yeah, I guess just in your own, whatever comes to mind first, in your dealings with spirits, like a positive success story that you've had, or just a crazy experience.
Well, and I've told it before in my own platforms, but one of the things that kind of launched me on, or was kind of how I became what I am today, was in South Carolina. There is a legend, and it's more than a legend because the man really did live. He did exist. It's a historical person, of a conjure man, a hoodoo man called Buzzard. Legendary rivalry between him and another conjure man that happened to be a local sheriff. Not to go into that whole story, because that could be a whole hour episode in and of itself. But Buzzard was legendary. He was famous in and of his time. He's one of the reasons why the old Southern hoodoo.
When was he alive? What time period are we talking?
I believe it was the early 1900s.
Oh.
So not ancient ago, but long enough. They had cars. But he was a legendary conjure man. People would come from, across the United States to do work with him and all of that. And in those days, that was impressive. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have the telephone system that we have now. They didn't have the communications. But he is reportedly buried on St. Helena Island. And as I said, I grew up with a certain hoodoo root, certain conjure root. Didn't recognize it at the time, kind of went off and did my own thing for a little while, studied a lot of stuff, whatever. I was probably 17, 18 years old. My grandmother had passed away. I was really getting into the spiritual side of things. I was trying a lot of stuff, doing a lot of the dumb shit that a lot of, beginner or baby witches or whatever you want to call them do, playing with Ouija boards and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And I thought that I was going to go out to St. Helena Island and I was going to go to the gravesite or try to find the gravesite of Doc Buzzard and commune with him and all that good shit, right? Went out there, had an almost, sounds silly, but in the process of doing that, I became completely lost in the woods. Didn't know where the hell I was, right? Dehydrated. Of course, didn't think to bring any type of communication device, any type of food, water, none of that shit. Just went out into the woods to look for this grave that somebody told me was there and pointed to a map. Had a almost religious experience. Yep. And during that experience is when I actually got my mantle as Dr. Crow. Woke up the next morning next to the gravesite that I don't remember finding. Still had no idea where the hell I was. Like I couldn't point to it on a map, couldn't have given people directions to it. Walked my way off that island to a little country store that I believe it still exists. It was called Mama's, and had a bowl of grits. And that's where I got my start. And that was actually because I had done a bunch of things before that. I had studied a lot of stuff. I had worked with Goetia. I had done things. I had seen manifestations happen. But that was the first time in my life that, at least to me, I had definitive proof that the spirit world is real.
Yeah. What you experienced was the fairy strain, it's called in the Celtic world. It's actually a very common experience that people have, but they don't know how to rationalize it or how to. But it always leads you somewhere you want to be, or opens a portal of a doorway. Mm-hmm. The UFO people call it missing time, but it's all the same experience. I think having it happen to me a few times, and funny enough, in the woods like yourself, you're entering into another dimension. It's as simple as that. You're in another time frame outside this space-time continuum, and there you're in the world of where the magic is, or where it comes from.
It's interesting that you say that, because the closest thing that I can describe it to is talking to people who have experienced they walked through a fairy ring and woke up 12 hours later, after experiencing, that time lapse. It is that same experience. It is that common experience.
It can happen. It can happen even in cities. It's a very, very common experience. And people think they had a period of delusion or a period of mental illness, or, something happened to them, a brain aneurysm or something. But no, it's a very, very common thing. And it's a shame that most people discount it, because you discovered directly because you were on a kind of a mission quest, but it does have a definite answer to it when it happens.
For sure.
Doc, on that same thread, I'd like to ask you too, within your traditions, are there malevolent entities that trick people? You mentioned Ouija boards and spirit boards and stuff. Is there a group of entities local to that part of the country that are tricksters that people will talk to on a Ouija board that'll tell you that, they're your dear Aunt Sally and will tell you everything you want to hear, and feed off of human emotions and feed off of of things like that? Is there something like that over there?
Well, generally speaking, yes. I mean, they're everywhere. I mean, it's just like when you talk about spirits in the spirit world, you know, in a way, it is a reflection of the real world. Okay. So in the real world, you have good people. You have people that are good natured, who are compassionate, who are charitable. And you have serial killers. You have monsters. Okay. Spirit world is no different. The same things exist. You have predators. And whether they are doing it, for example, when you talk about your trickster spirits, most of your trickster spirits, most of them are not truly malicious. And they're not really trying to harm or do evil, however you wish to classify that. Oftentimes they hand out painful lessons. Yeah. Or they're just trying to have a bit of fun because you stepped in some shit you weren't ready to step into.
Yeah.
You know, they say that the currency of the world of the elementals is human energy, and the trickster's also harvesting your energy, even if he's getting a laugh from it. Yeah. Where more malevolent ones will just go straight to root one and try to destroy you or terrorize you or something like that. Mm-hmm. The currency is human life force, human energy. But a trickster who does something, makes you do something silly or something like that, they procure your energy too. You know, even if you go, shit, well, why did they do that? You know, they've still got you. You know, they've still got the energy.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's it. You know, it's that pound of flesh. Yep. You know, there's a price to everything.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes you pay a penny, sometimes you pay a pound.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, there are, as far as regional goes, there's nothing. I mean, you have the people believe in bad spirits, people believe in demons, people believe in, you know, it really depends on what lens you're looking through. As far as what you choose to call them. But I mean, I've ran into human spirits that are just as malicious and in some ways even more baneful and evil, if you will, than some of the inhuman spirits I've run across.
Yeah, because the psychopaths know how we tick better than anybody.
Yeah. And a lot of times they're just doing it because they want to. You know, it's not even a matter of they want your energy to continue to exist. They're doing it just because they can, you know. And you run into that with some of your inhuman spirits, or what people will call demons. You know, how you choose to see them, you know, through your own spiritual lens is whatever. But they are hostile, malevolent entities that their sole purpose is to cause as much negative energy, is basically use you as a battery to get you to pump out negative energy so that they can eat. When they're done, they move on to the next. You know, you're a walking Capri Sun.
We've all met them.
Yeah, I was just going to say something like that, Thomas. I mean, anybody, you know, regular normie person, whatever, can have encounters with these types of things. You know, maybe it's like a really bad relationship or something in their family. But, you know, once you actually start stepping into magic circles and becoming a worker, whatever that means to you, these ordeals become much more frequent, much more rapid and much more intense. It's like a gauntlet. You know, you have to go through these things. And every time you overcome one, you get like a second to take a breath, and then the next one happens. And then, you know, after a while, you kind of sit there and you're like, holy shit, am I fucking losing my mind? Am I gaslighting myself? Did everything that just happened, did that actually fucking happen, or am I overreacting? Like, there's always that thing, like if something paranormal happens, you know, okay, well, like let's suss out, you know, is there a mundane explanation for why the fuck that just happened? You know, I always have to balance myself with that. Like, am I jumping to conclusions here? Like, am I trying to, you know, ascribe a meaning to something that maybe is just, you know, some bullshit that fucking happens? You know, there's regular assholes in the world. Or maybe I did something and I fucked myself over, you know, whatever. But you have to balance that out and weigh those questions when you have these experiences, and they are very fucking real. And I think the biggest thing is to just always keep that balance in mind, and ask yourself, you know, if you have a trusted friend or whatever, you know, did I overreact to that? Like, am I seeing some bullshit here that's like, doesn't need to be that extreme? But no, when you actually start working in these realms, that stuff does happen and it's very real. And it just gets more and more intense. So I just wanted to throw that in there as, I've had those experiences, and my whole life I've had experiences where just weird shit happened, and I wasn't really like on a path or anything working towards anything intentionally. But with those trickster spirits, yeah, they can, be there to actually do some good things for you. It doesn't look like it at the time, but then there's those ones that are there just to fucking wreck your life.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. And I mean, on that note, I'm actually glad you brought that up. What I like to tell people, especially people that I'm trying to mentor or guide, is the spirit world, whatever you choose to call it, always exists. It's always there. There's spirits everywhere, whether you see them or are aware of them or not, whether they see you or are aware of you or not. It's always there. And one of the things that people get surprised on, especially when they start walking down certain paths, start practicing certain things, start getting into certain things, they start seeing more shit. Well, it was always there. You're just now more aware of it. It was the shadow folk were always there. The fae folk have always been there. You're just now more aware of it. And the other thing that happens is that as you continue on into that world, the more aware of them you become, the more aware of you they become. So they start to notice that you can notice them.
Yeah, that's your charismatic charge building. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, you're glowing like a lamp in the darkness.
That's it.
Talk.
Exactly.
Can we ask you, as a Southern conjure man, what is your advice to an adept, a young adept or a young neophyte, to maintain a certain level of, if you want to just call it in Crowley terms, spiritual hygiene, so that, good decisions, discernment, what kind of things would you recommend to a young magician, or not even a young magician, an aspiring magician?
Well, one, when it comes to maintaining a spiritual space, right? Everybody talk about cleansing and protections and things of that nature. And that's very good, to definitely do that in whatever tradition, whether you're hanging evil eye protection or a witch's bottle or a cross on your front door, whatever it is, definitely do it. Especially if you're dabbling with spirits, because there are certain forms of magic that don't focus on spirits themselves, but it's like maintaining a castle. There's no such thing as a cannon-proof wall. There's no such thing as a bulletproof vest. You have to maintain those protections, but also learn that to not overreact, to look at things in some ways logically, right? Just because something looks dark, just because that shadow person walks across your room, doesn't mean they're there to do evil. That's not your sign to break out the sage or the Palo Santo or the Florida water, or the holy water, call up the priest. That could be, an entity that's lost or just wandering through or just passing through. Your reaction to that spirit may do more damage, may catch the attention of that spirit where it had no interest before. You may piss it off in trying to get rid of it, and now it becomes a problem. So don't just assume that just because you can see it, that it's there to do harm. It may not even notice you.
Yeah, it's the same as like certain people. You might be in a bar or pub or something, and some guy comes in covered in tattoos and scars on his face, and he looks like a really nasty piece of work. And lo and behold, you discover he's the most beautiful soul you'll ever meet. And then some other guy comes in, looks like Donny Osmond, and he's an absolute psychopath. You have to treat the entities the same way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And don't just walk up to the guy with tattoos and try to banish him from the bar.
Right.
Gonna get your ass handed to you.
Yeah. But that's some great advice. I really like that.
I mean, don't assume anything, and try to be aware of your surroundings. And to some extent, you have to learn to balance your gut feeling versus the logical side of things.
Yeah, I often say that anyone who's involved in the occult and stops being a detective, they're going to be in serious trouble, because you've got to be like Columbo when you work in that world. this is why it's called the art and science of magic, because you have to have the scientific mind too. And you can't just, where the new age idea of jumping in and embracing it as it is extremely dangerous. You always have to be a detective. It always has to be measured.
You have to have a certain skepticism.
Yep.
And not just about the world around you, but about yourself too.
Big time. Yeah.
No, yep. It's is that feather a sign, or is it just
am I bullshitting? Yeah. Just you might want something to have, some great meaning, but it doesn't always mean it. We live in a world of shit's always happening, and there's always stuff, appearing before our eyes and shit. So having that really good centered space within yourself to observe those things, and then, not just go out and fuck around and find out, and, results-based magic, that's really dangerous. People who just go out and push, and they don't give a shit what they do. And, just to get a result, to get high off of it, and, say that they had an experience or whatever. It's like, well, yeah, you're going to have an experience, and I don't think it's the one that you were looking for.
Well, it's also, in my own practice, and, I fully believe that if you don't check yourself, something
wreck yourself. Yeah. I should have checked myself, said the guy who wrecked himself. It's like, those can be really powerful lessons for the people who can persist. But I think a lot of those people end up just falling off because it's too scary, and they get afraid, or, maybe they get walked into, or something really bad happens. Best case scenario for those type of people, I think would be for them to just be scared off and just leave it. If they're not ready to confront those things.
Yeah. And I mean, to some extent, I like to joke that I'm so used to seeing certain things now that they don't bother me. Once you reach to a certain point in life, I don't know if it's just experience or old age or whatever it is, but how many shadow people do you have to see before that's no longer a big deal? And when you really think about it logically, okay, if a spirit comes and picks this up and moves it across the room, the first time you see that, that's some scary shit. Yeah. But when you think about it, I can do that easily. I can move this across the room just like that. Didn't even break a sweat doing it. So how amazing is that? It's great, but people are going to freak out about it. People are going to, when they see it happen and no one's standing there, they can't see, that scares them. But that spirit might just be trying to get your attention, and you have no idea how much energy they just had to expend to catch your attention. They didn't mean it. They didn't throw it at you. It was nothing malicious. Maybe they're just trying to communicate, and it's easy for me to pick that up and move it because I have a physical body. I have bones and muscles, and my energy is moving in order to do that. In order to do that without that physical body is a great test of will. So it is significant in and of the fact that that spirit is trying to communicate, it's trying to show you. It may be telling you that, hey, or trying to get your attention to tell you that, hey, there's a suitcase full of money buried under the floor that you don't know about, that it left there 40 years ago. And if you whip out the sage and you whip out the Palo Santo and the Florida water and call the priest and drive it out, you may be missing, the whole point because of fear, because of overreaction.
Right.
So it pays to take a step back. And
yeah, Thomas has just talked recently about impulse and having impulse control, and not, just reacting to some bit of news or something that you saw too early, without balancing it out with logic and reason, and, and your gut feelings about things too. So yeah, I like the way that you just described that.
Can I tell a quick story? Doc just reminded me of something when he said when you see a feather, it's not necessarily an ancestor communicating. I used to work in Lower Manhattan in the Wall Street area up until 1998. And I can remember those in amongst all those skyscrapers, hawks hunt. We used to see them tearing birds to bits on the outside your office windows. It's the weirdest thing. Here you are in the seat of capitalism and nature in its most raws outside your window, that kind of thing. And just before I was returning back to Ireland, I was walking down Wall Street towards the church that leads to the World Trade Center. And I look up and I see a pair of pigeon's wings with no pigeon's body coming down like a sycamore seed, spinning down. And right from where the World Trade Center is, And I looked at that and I went, well, that is some augury, all right. And then I said, nah, it's just there's birds of prey all over these buildings. And I laughed it off. But you know something, it was because it was only 2 years later that those towers came down, and the bird without wings, well, I mean, the symbolism there is obvious. But yeah, so sometimes you can run away with it and see things where there's nothing, but sometimes you can dismiss it, and then the resolution happens over the course of time.
Absolutely. That other side of the coin is absolutely correct as well. And it takes experience and time to learn how to differentiate between the two. And you're not going to get it right every time. You're not. I have peers who are, tarot readers and work with certain forms of divination. It was like, you're not going to get it right every time. This isn't like the stock market ticket tape where you're getting constant updates continuously. You can read things wrong. You get mixed energies. You get mixed signals. If we could understand and translate everything the spirit has to tell us, we wouldn't need any of it. We would know. There would be no questions of, did Atlantis exist? Is there a God? Is there an afterlife? They wouldn't be questions. We'd have answers. They'd be facts, and that's part of the science and the art of working those things out. Something like that. What I try to tell people is, because one of the things these days is candle reading wax. And what I try to tell people is pay attention to what is out of the norm. Like, for example, if you're used to seeing feathers on the sidewalk because they're praying birds, or because you have a bird's nest by your house, or whatever the case is, maybe not every feather is a sign. If a dead bird slams into your bedroom window at 3 a.m. in the morning, and it happens again the next week, maybe something's trying to get your attention. Or if you see two birds' wings, fluttering down, like a fallen angel, maybe you should write that down, make a note, but the same thing with like candle reading. Back to that. And one of the reasons why I pointed out is because you have people who will buy a candle. They'll walk into a dollar store or a Walmart or wherever it is. They'll buy a candle. They'll use the candle in a working or a prayer service, and then they'll try to read the wax. Well, there's 100 different factors in that. Number one, you again, to the scientific method, are you familiar with that candle brand? Maybe the candle just burns that way. Maybe it's a flaw in the manufacturing. Maybe the wick wasn't trimmed enough. Maybe you put too much shit on top of the candle. Repeat it. If you do the same working with the same prayer service 3 times using the same candle from the same manufacturer, and it comes out the same way every time, chances are it's probably just that candle. Now, if you do that and it comes out the same way 3 times, but on that 4th time, the candle shatters or it goes up in a ball of fire and nothing is different, that might be something trying to tell you something. That's something you may want to pay attention to. But that's through the method, that's through experience. And there's just a certain level of knowledge and a certain level of awareness that you can only get from experience. We're all going to wake up on our own islands in the middle of the woods and not know where the hell we are at some point. Everybody's got to do it. It's the baby steps. It's cutting your teeth.
I like that. Beautifully put. Well, we got to wrap it up here. We've got another show coming up here live at the top of the hour. And Doc, this has been an amazing last little hour or so here talking to you. We'd definitely like to have you on again here soon for another episode of this. We could continue talking about this for hours, I'm sure. But let me hand it over to Tim.
Yeah, next time we have you on, I want to hear the full story of the Doc Buzzard. I want to hear that tale and the battle that took place, the magical battle that took place there.
Definitely.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And so much gratitude for you taking the time out of your day to come here and join us on the symposium. we've been looking forward to this for so long, and I'm so glad we finally nailed it down. And everybody's busy. We're in 3 different time zones here. It took a little bit of finagling, but we did it. So anyways, one last thing, where can people find information about you? I know you've just kind of restarted up your YouTube and your website and all that stuff. How can people find you?
Well, my YouTube is the Rum and Bones Show with Dr. Crow. You can find me on Facebook at Wicked Little Things. You can also go to my website, which is wickedlittlethings.com. If you type in Dr. Crow on Facebook, I'll pop up. So I'm there.
Fantastic. Thomas, any last words from you?
No, it's been wonderful. As you guys know, I'm fascinated by American folk magic and occultism and folklore in the same way you guys over there might be interested in our stuff here because it's exotic or whatever. So it was great to have one of the luminaries of that tradition on the show. And I've enjoyed this very much. I can't wait for you to come back, Doc.
Absolutely.
Doc's the real deal. All right, you guys. Well, everybody enjoy this episode. Any questions, comments, concerning Southern root work? Doc, are you a part of our Beyond Room 313 Facebook group?
Yes, I am.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, feel free to share some of your stuff in there. I know, like I said, most of our audience is European, so I think a lot of them, this is just going to be kind of brand new and will spark a lot of interest, I'm sure. So it'd be great to have you share some of your stuff in there.
Will do. It was a pleasure.
All right, my friend. We'll catch you later.
Yes, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Bye.